Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, we're talking about my top 10 albums of 2024. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So 2024 was a fantastic year for music. So many great albums came out. It was hard for me to put together just a top 10. I had about 25 or 30 albums that I considered. So I've got my top 10 and I've got some really good honorable mentions also. So my first honorable mention came out back on May 31st, and I didn't know anything about this band until after this album came out. And this is their second album. I did pick up their first album also. So this was actually recommended to me in the Vinyl Den Facebook group. And the first day I listened to it, I must have listened to it at least 5 or 6 times. And that's Gangster Love by Super American. And they're one of those newer pop punk bands that have come up over the last couple of years. But where a lot of that newer stuff is very much like cut and paste, kind of pop punk, it sound like a bad Blink-182 ripoff. Super American is not like that. They very much have their own sound. I'd love to see where this band is going to go next. So on March 15th, something came out that I thought I would never see, and that is a new Black Crowes album. So this is their first album since 2009, I think was their last album of new material. Happiness Bastards I was really impressed with. I've not been a fan of the last few Black Crowes albums. Finally, Chris and Rich put all their issues aside and created one of the best albums that they've done since the very beginning of their career. So the next honorable mention is actually an album I just recently talked about on an episode of the Vinyl Den where we went over our most surprising albums of the year. So this album came out back on June 28th, and that was When the Music Stops by Jaden. So Jaden got his big break as a TikTok star several years ago. I think it was like 2019 when he kind of blew up on TikTok. And he was actually the first artist signed to Travis Barker's DTA label. And when he released his debut album, I was not a fan of it. Like I said earlier, a lot of the newer punk stuff is very much cut and paste. It's very like copycat, almost like a bad tribute band kind of music. And that's kind of the vibe I got from his debut album. I know a lot of people loved it. I could never get into it. So I didn't have really any kind of expectations when he released his new album. He shows a lot of musical growth on here. He's gotten away from a lot of that punk stuff. It's definitely more poppy. There's some rock elements on here also. There's some like singer-songwriter kind of acoustic stuff on here also. It's just a really good listen. I know a lot of people out there are going to complain about me including this next one, but it is a really good album. It's not my top 10, but I do think it's a really good album. This was released back on April 19th, and that is The Tortured Poets Department by Taylor Swift. To be honest, when this album first came out, I wasn't a huge fan of it. It took me a long time to get into it, and it really wasn't until I finally got around listening to the anthology where I'm like, okay, it's not, this isn't folklore. It's not one of her best albums, but it's got some really good tracks on here. This album was once again produced by Jack Antonoff, and I think I know her and Jack have done a lot of really good stuff over the last several albums, but I think it's time for her to kind of break away, and start working with a different producer. So on the anthology version, so the second half of this album, a lot of that is produced by Aaron Dessner, and I really like the way that the two of them work together. I think some of those tracks actually work better than a lot of the stuff on the first half of the album. So the next honorable mention is the complete polar opposite end of the music spectrum from Taylor Swift, and that is The Chisel, What a Fucking Nightmare. This came out back, and I think it was February 9th when this one came out. I'm typically not a big hardcore punk fan or street punk fan. I really enjoyed this album, though, and I was not expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. Yes, like I said, it's a hardcore punk album, but there's also some more traditional rock elements on here. They've got some really catchy tracks on here, which you typically don't get in hardcore punk. It's one that I've listened to quite a bit this year. And then my last honorable mention is an album that I also talked about in the video where I went over my most surprising albums of the year, because I didn't really know what to expect with this one. This one came out back on July 19th, and that is No Name by Jack White. So when he released, 2 years ago when he released his last 2 albums, I thought they were good. I wasn't really blown away by them, though. And I felt like the last couple of Jack White solo albums weren't, like, really great. But this one, I think this is easily one of the best albums he's ever recorded. Very much like more of a return to like a straightforward blues rock, kind of garage rock sound. And it just works for what Jack White does musically. I would even put this album up there with some of the best albums that he did with White Stripes. So the album that I've got number 10 is another one of those bands where I didn't know anything about this band until, just a couple months ago. This album came out back on October 11th, and that is No Obligation by the Lindas. So they are a band that I saw open for Green Day in the summertime, and I was really impressed with these girls. They're I think 3 of the 4 of them are still in high school. Their drummer's only 14 years old. I think this is a band we're going to hear a lot from over the next couple of years. If you're a fan of like late 90s punk music, think like the Donnas, I think you're really going to enjoy this album. I've listened to a bunch since the album came out. Actually, they just announced that they're going to have a North American tour in 2025, so I'm hoping to see them again. The album I've got at number 9 is another one of those bands where I think they're going to do a bunch of great stuff over the next few years. Really good up-and-coming band. They're from the UK. They've got kind of a funny name. The band is Stank Finger. The album is 3 Finger Discount. They're a new ska punk band from the UK. This is just a fun, catchy album. If you're a fan of late 90s, early 2000s, Less Than Jake, I think you're really going to enjoy this album. You can hear on this album, this is a band that's not taking themselves too seriously. They're just doing what they love and having a lot of fun doing it. The album I've got number 8 was actually my number 5 album at the mid-year, so it's kind of slid down a little bit down my list since then, but it's still a really good album. It was, I think this was my most anticipated album of 2024, and that is Dark Matter by Pearl Jam. I've been a big Pearl Jam fan for a really long time, and I might be in the minority that, when I say that I love their last few albums. I think Gigaton was a little bit of a step down, but Lightning Bolt, I think, is one of their top 5 or 6 albums. I think I would put Dark Matter as probably their 3rd or 4th best album of the 2000s. I think it's definitely a better album than Gigaton. I don't think it's quite as good as Lightning Bolt or Binaural, but it is a really good album. And the track Upper Hand is probably one of my favorite Pearl Jam tracks of the last probably 25 years. It is that good. I know a lot of people are calling this a return to form album, which I don't really think it is, because I think, like I said, their last few albums have been really good. But as far as like mainstream success goes, I can see why people are saying that. My number 7 album was my number 3 album at the mid-year. So there's another one that's kind of slid down. And it's not because of this album. It's been the strength of some of the other albums that have come out in the last half of the year. This one also came out back on January 19th, and is Saviors by Green Day. Father of All Motherfuckers was not a good album. I am sorry. I know there's people out there that love it. I thought it was trash. I thought it was garbage. There's not a whole lot on there. I guess I should backtrack a little bit. I have listened to it multiple times over the last couple of months, and there are a couple of okay tracks on there. But even the best tracks would be the worst tracks on pretty much every other Green Day album. So I didn't really know what to expect with Saviors. And I was really impressed. This is easily, in my opinion, the band's best album since American Idiot. I know musically this isn't a whole lot different than any of the stuff on Father of All, but the songs are better, the lyrics are better mostly. It's just a beginning and a much better album. So the album that I've got at number 6 is another one I didn't really know what to expect when it was released. This one came out back on October 25th. That is The Great Impersonator by Halsey. So this is the follow-up to her 2021 album, If I Can't Have Love, I Want Power, which was one of my top 3 albums of that year. That album was produced by Trent Reznor, and I was hoping moving forward she would continue to work with Trent, but she decided to go down a different path with this album. And I know she's been through a lot in her personal life between the 2 albums. She had a couple of big health scares, didn't really know if she was going to survive, and a lot of that came through in the lyrics on this album. That's why this is such a dark album. And because she wasn't working with Trent, that's kind of why I was kind of hesitant on it and didn't really know what to expect. But as soon as I streamed the first 3 or 4 songs, I immediately got online in order to copy this album. And kind of the overarching theme for this album is, what Halsey's life would have been had she lived in different decades. So she's got 70s, she's got 80s, she's got 90s. Those are the themes that she has across this album. And she used some of her biggest influences. She didn't really try to copy their sound on this album, but she used them as influence. And it does come through on some of the tracks on here. So we made it to the top 5. The album I've got at number 5 was actually my number 4 album on my mid-year list. This one came out back on January 5th, and that is The Runs by Scooped Up. They're another one of those young up-and-coming bands. This is their 2nd album. If you listen to this album, if you're unfamiliar with this band, and you're a fan of late 90s, early 2000s punk, this sounds like it could be an album straight off of Warped Tour 99, and I mean that as a big compliment. When you listen to this album, I get a very early Blink-182 or a very early Green Day vibe from this band. they're having a lot of fun recording this music. It comes through on this album. They're actually a blast to follow on social media also. It's easily one of my most listened to albums of the year. Another one of those bands where, I really wish that a bigger band would pick them up and take them on tour with them, because I think they really deserve to have a bigger exposure. They're going to do some great albums moving forward, I think. So the album that I've got at number 4 was actually on my mid-year list. It was number 2 on that one. It's kind of dropped back a little bit, but it's still a great album. Came out back on January 26th, and that is Blood, Hair, and Eyeballs by Alkaline Trio. So this is the band's first album since Matt Skiba returned to the band from being in Blink-182 and releasing a couple albums with them. The recording process was a little bit different on this album than what they did in the past. This is the first album in a long time where the entire band was together in the recording studio, putting these songs together. And I think the end product ended up being one of their most cohesive albums. I think it's one of the best albums the band ever did. And the song Broken Down in a Time Machine is easily one of my favorite tracks of the year. I'm hoping Alkaline Trio does more albums like this in the future. So my number 3 album is one I thought I would never see. I've talked about this album for the last couple of years. I thought it was going to get released, and it never got released. We finally saw it in 2024. Came out back on November 1st, and that is Songs of a Lost World by The Cure. This is the band's first album in 16 years. They released 413 Dream back in, 2008 is when that album came out. But I've not been a big fan of their last couple of albums. I think their last really great album was Wish back in 1992. So when they announced that this album was going to come out, I didn't really know what to expect. And then I saw them live last summer, and they played, I think, 6 tracks off this album. And, yes, there's sometimes there could be a disconnect between what you hear live and what's on the album. But, I really liked them live, and I kind of had some hope for this album, and I was blown away by it. This is easily their best album since Wish. It's a very dark album. Robert Smith used a lot of inspiration from his personal life on this album. He lost his mother, he lost his brother over the last few years, and that really kind of directed the sound on this album. So my number 2 album of 2024 is probably the most divisive album of the year. People either love this album or hate this album. A lot of people out there refuse to listen to it just because they don't like the lead singer, but they came out back on November 15th, and that's From Zero by Linkin Park. Of course, this is the first album that the band has released since Emily Armstrong replaced Chester Bennington. And Chester is one of those lead singers where you're never going to be able to replace him. And I give the band a lot of credit for the way they handled this. They didn't try to find somebody that sounded like Chester. They tried to go in a different direction. Yes, there are musically some similarities in their singing styles. She can sing some of Chester's songs, but the way that her and Mike Shinoda play off each other vocally and lyrically, they do it in ways that Mike could have never done and never did do with Chester. This is one of those albums, to be honest with you, I went into listening to it expecting to hate it. But I was instantly drawn into it. There are some classic tracks on here. There is some stuff on here that I think is the best stuff that Linkin Park has done since Meteora. I know a lot of Linkin Park fans are going to hate that, but say what you want about Emily and her personal life. I really don't care about any of that. The only thing I care about is the music, and she shines on a lot of these tracks. So that brings me down to my number 1 album of 2024, and this is an album that I was not expecting to be here because it was number 1 on my mid-year list, and albums I got my top 5 in July typically don't make it in my top 5 at the end of the year. But this album was just that good. This album was released back on April 26th as East Side of Eden by Jen Razavi. If you go on streaming services, I think she's under Gen Pop on there, but she's one of the co-lead singers of the Bomb Pops. So when she announced that she was going to release a solo album, I thought this was going to be more like punk-driven kind of music, and there really isn't on here. It's a much more musically diverse album, and I think the way I've compared this album before is I think it has like almost a Bangles type sound on this album. And it's one that I hope she does more albums like this moving forward. I'm sure she's going to continue on with her solo career. I'm not really sure what's going on with the Bomb Pops, but this gives me a lot of hope for what she's going to do musically. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. 2024 has been an incredible year for music. I'm sure 2025 is going to be just as good, but drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys' favorite albums of 2024 were. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.